Much better, huh? We're going to get started. It is raining and more rain. But don't let that daunt you because it's dry inside here. Hey, we're going to get started this afternoon. We're going to be here for about 90 minutes. This is going to go real well, and I promise we'll get a chance to engage the director as well as Chief Harteau, Chief Smith, Chief Potts, and others. But this is meant to be, after Director Davis is done speaking for a few minutes, to be an engaging conversation, right? You're welcome to ask questions, dialogue, discussion, whatever it is that you call it back in your agencies or out in the community. So I'm really pleased that all of you had a chance to come here this afternoon. I'm going to introduce, like I said, Director Davis here in just a minute. I want to thank our sponsors, though. There's a number of people here from the Hennepin County Sheriff Foundation, St. Paul Police Department, Chief Smith, certainly the Ramsey County Sheriff's Office, and Minneapolis and others. You all know who I am. And remember, a sheriff is elected by the residents of our county. And my job is to implement the vision of the residents of the county in partnership with the local police chiefs. They're out there every single day, the men and women who work in their agencies. And their expectations for accountability in law enforcement, your expectations. Now that posed me to a very unique position, I think, and that's being that I'm charged directly with the responsibility for ensuring that our agency reflects the communities we serve and the values and priorities of the residents countywide. The recommendations of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing have direct application for me as a sheriff, but they also have direct application for community leaders and our police officers, the men and women who serve us every single day across this county and do, quite honestly, a phenomenal job. So public safety isn't about what happens in a jail cell or in the courtroom, despite what some people think. Public safety is really what happens in our homes, our neighborhoods, our schools, our businesses, and of course our places of worship. We all share that responsibility for maintaining public safety in whatever shape, manner, or form it takes in your local community. That's exactly what the task force was asked to do. They were asked to create a framework for agencies and community members to evaluate and improve the partnerships between police and their residents. We're service-oriented, folks. The Hennepin County Sheriff's Office has already implemented many of these recommendations of the task force. In 2007, our Community Advisory Board, and there's a number of them here today with us, we put them together to seek resident input and oversight to help us with policies and guide us in what we do countywide as a sheriff's office. And in 2009, our community engagement team went to work with residents as liaisons to minority groups, and especially new Americans. Remember, we are a very divergent county. In my county alone, 1.2 million residents, over 400,000 residents are people just like that. We welcome them here. We've always been a very place where people could assimilate and integrate into our communities. It means a lot. I think through these efforts, though, and others, we're working to build trust and legitimacy. And I know Chief Harteau, her and I have had this conversation a number of times. I've heard her speak on it. She's going to talk to you a little bit about that, about what that means to her and the Minneapolis Police Department. Chief Smith, I hope you do likewise. Chief Potts is going to be up here as well. But we have more work to do to adopt the recommendations of the task force. And my command staff here at the Sheriff's Office has been working through every one of the recommendations, Ron, every single one of them, and action items where we can make improvements. Some apply to us, some do not, but we are working diligently on them. We're going to be meeting over the next several weeks as our command staff when we put together our 2016 strategic plan. It'll be a cornerstone of what we do in the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office, and I know from talking with a number of the suburban police chiefs in Hennepin County, likewise for them. The outcome of this review will become part of our, like I said, our agency-wide strategic planning for 2016. We're going to implement and expand on our commitment to these recommendations. For the Sheriff's Office, it's an opportunity to reorient our agency's mission to better serve the residents of our county. While I serve as sheriff, I'm first and foremost a police officer. Like many of you, at least the law enforcement folks in the room, I've been in public service for 32 plus years. I absolutely love it day in and day out. It's rewarding most days. It has challenges other days. You take the ups and the downs, but overall, I absolutely love what I do, and I know if you ask other law enforcement professionals in the room, they will tell you likewise. I got my start in Cottage Grove. It was a very small agency at the time. It was about 16, 17 police officers, and they policed 3 different cities. I had a chance to go to work for Minneapolis Police, where I worked the streets among hundreds of officers, very good officers who cared about what they do day in and day out. Like I said, it's about who I am. I'm very proud to serve as your elected sheriff. And to be quite honest, this past year has been difficult for police community relations across our country. You can't turn on the TV, open a newspaper, go through social media without seeing some incident, either because there's video or circumstances, 24/7 news coverage of what's happening across this country in terms of police and community relations. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they don't get it right. Sometimes we don't get it right. Either way, to be honest, this past year, like I said, has been really difficult. And while this has become a topic of national concern, police community relationships are not managed at the national level. I just got off a flight from DC. I met this morning with Congressman Reichert and another congressman who are working in Congress to help police community relations. We had this candid conversation with them about police community relations are local. We police our communities based on what our communities want us to do in terms of their local law enforcement. And that's why I welcome the task force's recommendations, Ron. Other officers and residents and other chief law enforcement officers like myself, we all need a roadmap. This is going to be a framework for improving what we do with our communities. Our organizations internally, and the ways we communicate with the broader community, and of course in developing those strategies for fostering deeper trust and I hope more meaningful resident participation. A part of that is this afternoon. In my mind, these recommendations couldn't come at a better time, and it allows us all a fresh look at the fundamental responsibility to serve and protect. It's what we do. So with that, I'm going to welcome our terrific guest. He flew a long ways. He must have been ahead of me on the flight this afternoon coming out from D.C. Ron was chairman of the President's Task Force and the director of the Department of Justice Office for Community-Oriented Policing. Ron has been a police officer and a police chief. 20 years with the Oakland Police Department, chief in Palo Alto, California for over 8 years. He has a bachelor's degree from Southern Illinois University. He served in a number of different capacities in his career. He's an all-around good guy. He's very well respected by chiefs and sheriffs and line officers across this country. When President Obama made this appointment, he did so diligently and with foresight and forethought about who he was picking to lead the COPS office, because we as local law enforcement, we work with them every single day. It could be on an issue like this. It could be funding for more police officers out in the street or in our schools, body cameras, you name it. We look to the COPS office. They're our friends, they're our partner. And Ron, I'm very pleased you took the time to come out here this afternoon. We're going to hear you about some of these recommendations from the task force, about why this task force was put in place. What was the outcome? I know you had a number of meetings, both in DC, but also across the country. I had a chance to testify. A number of other people did. And at the end of the day, like I said, these recommendations are going to be our roadmap for the Sheriff's Office, and I think many local law enforcement agencies. One other quick thing, Ron, we just met major county sheriffs out on Mackinac Island, a beautiful spot. There were 40 of us representing over 100 million of the nation's population. We talked about this specifically. Every single one of those sheriffs walking out of that room that day at the Grand Hotel talked about these pillars, talked about the recommendations from the task force, and how we as our chief law enforcement officers go back to work not just within our agencies, but also with our local law enforcement partners. And so please come up. We're looking forward to hearing you. Give Ron a round of applause.
Thank you, Sheriff. I really appreciate that. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Well, we'll try that one more time. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So, Sheriff, I actually came from Laughlin, Nevada. I was telling the group earlier today that I had the opportunity yesterday to speak to the Arizona Association of Chiefs of Police, about 150 police chiefs in Arizona, who are doing an annual conference in Nevada. I'll leave that alone. But it was still a good conference. We had the opportunity to talk about the task force. Let me start. The sheriff already said this. One, let me thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate your leadership. For those who live in this county, in this region, you know the sheriff locally for his law enforcement leadership in the region. But I do want to share with you that he's also looked to nationally for his leadership from a national perspective, whether it's through major counties, national sheriffs, or just his perspectives. And it was very good for us to hear from him at the task force when he shared the experiences as a law enforcement expert, but also shared the experiences of the great work that was being done in this county. And so that helped really shape the recommendations. Before I get into it, a lot of the recommendations for the task force really came from the field, so that the idea was not the task force had to recreate recommendations, but to really identify the best work. As the sheriff mentioned, I myself had 30 years in police work, and I had the opportunity to spend 20 years in the great city of Oakland, a very diverse major city in California. And through that time, I could see the strength of a community, but also saw some of the challenges that many of our urban centers are dealing with. I left Oakland when I was a captain to become the chief in the city of East Palo Alto, a small city in the Bay Area, a city at that time of about 33,000, but a city of diversity, 90% of color, large Hispanic population, African-American population, a growing Pacific Islander population, and once dubbed the murder capital of the United States due to significant homicides and violence. And I mention that because in engaging as a chief, the key for reducing crime to me was community policing, was the relationships, and so I bring that perspective. I also bring the perspective of serving in a major department and also serving in a small department. And as we look around the country, there are over 16,000 police department and sheriff's offices around the country that represent policing in the United States. And we have to remember, we quite often focus on the larger cities and even the larger counties, but we can't forget that many of our policing, the majority of them, are small towns, whether they're small towns in Minnesota, whether they're small towns in California. So policing is very diverse in the United States. Now, I would tell you in my 30 years, I've seen a lot. I've seen, as I mentioned before, just the damage that the damage firsthand that communities face with crime and violence. Like many of you in the room, I had to knock on the door to tell a mother that her child was killed by gang violence and the devastation that it brings. Also, as a chief, I had to knock on the door and tell a widow, and now to be a widow, that her husband, one of my officers, was shot and killed in line of duty. So we know the violence, the damage that the violence caused. We know that it takes a toll on the community as a whole, including that of our police officers. But I've also seen the strength and the true strength and resilience of a community that works together with the police department, that comes together to solve crimes, that reduces violence, makes it safe for the community and for the officers that are serving those communities. I've seen over the last 30 years diversity change in the department. The way the profession looks in 2015 is completely different than it did in 1985 when I became a police officer at the age of 12. This looks different. I was seeing if you guys caught that one, if you're paying attention. So, but no, not quite at the age of 12, but still in 1985, it looks different. I look at how we use technology. I recall in 1985 when I sat in a police car, I was just amazed that it had this big square thing called a mobile digital terminal, and how thick, at that time, it was state of the art. I recall when we were issued pagers, think about how many people know what a pager is these days? How many kids know that? We were issued a pager, and we thought it was just the highest thing in the world, that you even had to get a credit check to get the pager. It was almost like they were giving you some top of the technology. And now look at my 13-year-old daughter. She has enough technology to monitor the global economy on her little iPad. And so the technology has advances. We have made advances in community policing, how we engage the community, how we recruit, how we train. And so I want to start with this, that we should never deny the progress that we made. And I say we as law enforcement because, I would say very few professions have advanced the way we have advanced. And we should start the discussion by acknowledging our successes. Too often we focus on the negative and we don't acknowledge the success. We have made a lot of success. But if we're being honest, we've also missed a few areas. And as a result of missing those areas, we left a lot of people behind. As a result of not making changes in some areas, whether it's the way we incarcerate, whether it's some ways we fight crime, we have resulted in mass incarceration rates, disparate incarceration rates. We have left communities that feel disenfranchised. We have some of the highest incarceration rates in the free world. Our recidivism rates are high. So we know we've made a lot of progress on one hand, but we also know that we have a lot of work to do. And what really brings us home is, I was sharing with the group earlier today, is I went to the swearing-in ceremony of New York Commissioner Bill Bratton when he first was appointed the New York Commissioner again. And Bill said something during the ceremony that stood out for me. And he was talking about, that NYPD was really amid a 30 or 40-year low in crime and violence. And as a result of that, when he started going around the communities, he was shocked at what he was getting back from the community. I think he was expecting more of how happy we are that homicides are down, that crime is down, and that violence is down. And what he got were a community that was tense, that there was mistrust, and that people wanted some changes in policing. And what he realized then, and what he shared with his officers, and what I'm sharing with you, is something that we've known for years. The ends do not justify the means, and in a democracy, how you fight crime is as important as the crime reduction itself. And so as we proceed forward, as we look at how we fight crime, that we cannot leave communities behind. We cannot decimate a community in the name of crime reduction or mass incarcerate our way into public safety. We have to engage communities with dignity and respect. We have to make sure we have legitimacy, that we earn the trust and respect, and we're going to have to engage in criminal justice reform, not just police reform. We need to take a look at sentencing. We need to take a look at why we incarcerate, how long we incarcerate, what we provide people while they're in jail, the second chances we give them when they come out of jail. We need to take a look at mentoring, the opportunities we provide our young men, especially young men of color. We have an opportunity to start changing the way policing looks in this country, and it starts now. So when I think about this task force, I think about it followed the tragic shooting of Michael Brown, but the work of building trust started with the president as soon as he took office. He made this a priority to build trust, because what we know is that trust and policing are hand in hand. You cannot fight crime if you don't have the trust of the community. You cannot solve crime if people are not going to report crime to you or trust the community. So after the Michael Brown shooting, the president in December 2014 announced that he was going to create a task force that the sheriff talked about. And what he said at the time of the task force was interesting. And he said, look, we want to bring a task force together that will, one, identify some concrete recommendations on how we can improve trust between the police and the community, and I'm going to say the community and the police. Because in community policing, the police and the community are co-producers of public safety. It's not just the police. For those who are in law enforcement, know there's a Sir Robert Peel is the founder of modern-day law enforcement, and our history tells us that this was created in 1829. And he has 9 principles of policing that Sir Robert Peel developed. One of them is that the police are the public and the public are the police, but the police are just the ones who are getting paid to facilitate the public safety. But it suggests that we're co-producers. And so by having the police, we don't abdicate our responsibility as community members. We work with the police. They're a part of our community. They should not be necessarily just an opposing force that comes in the community. So in that sense, there's a difference between community policing and policing a community. What we want are community policing where we're one and the same. But police are the ones that are trained, that are experts, that we want to lead that. But going back to, so the president wanted this task force to take a look at how do we build trust between communities and police, but at the same time, make sure that we're still engaging in the strategies, the effective strategies that ensure that we're looking at our downward trajectory of crime and violence, so that we have public safety. And in that sense, for me, when I look at public safety, then it gives us an opportunity to redefine what that means. And for some people, I think for the last maybe 10 or 20 years, for many, public safety was the statistical crime reduction. And if that's the only focus, then we lose touch with the community. We may engage even inadvertently and unintentionally in the kind of strategies that have collateral damage. But if public safety is not just the reduction of crime and must include the presence of justice, then both have to exist for this to be a true public safety strategy. So the president asked for trust and also crime reduction. He put together 11 amazing people to come together. Now, it was interesting, when he put the 11 people together, he put together a couple of police chiefs, a retired sheriff who's now running a state police academy, a civil rights attorney whose claim to fame, according to her, was that she basically sued the heck out of police departments, 2 young people who literally just came off the lines in Ferguson and New York of demonstrating, and an academic or 2 that basically done a lot of research on this. And so when we started, it was a very diverse group with diverse perspectives. Now, I say diverse, some people would say divided, but there's a distinction between diversity and division. Diversity is healthy, division is not. And so we had these diverse perspectives, and he named 2 co-chairs. One was Charles Ramsey, who's the police commissioner in Philadelphia, and one was Lori Robinson, who's a professor at George Mason University, and she's the former assistant attorney general for the Office of Justice Programs. The president then said, you have 90 days. And when he first said that, everybody's eyebrows went up going, what could you possibly do in 90 days, and how can you get it done? But like many of us in this room, whether it's the sheriff that asked us, or it's this state senator or a U.S. senator or a mayor or a governor, and now you imagine the commander-in-chief himself says 90 days, you're not going to question it. You just say, yes, sir, Mr. President, we'll get it done. And so we basically came together and we decided the best way to divvy up the work was to come into these 6 pillars. which you, I think, have a handout on, and I'm just going to talk about them briefly. And we thought by framing the discussion or the task force work around the 6 pillars, we could actually frame at least some kind of roadmap of where we're going to go. Otherwise, this thing could really be too large, we will lose control of it, and we have to make sure we focused on the topic that the president asked for. So the first one was building trust and legitimacy. And although it's the first pillar, in many ways, it's kind of the foundational pillar that has to exist. And we want to know what are the recommendations we could come up with that would help law enforcement build trust and legitimacy that the community would have for them. The second one was policy and oversight, and that looked at everything from use of force policies to civilian oversight to the varying ways in which we oversee and govern and regulate and manage police functions, if you will. The third one was technology and social media. And when you look at, and that looked at everything from the use of body cameras to how we use social media, whether it was, how we use social media following the Boston bombing versus how we used it to manage demonstrations or not, following Ferguson, Michael Brown shooting. We also looked at community policing and crime reduction. And this was a reminder that if we're going to talk about trust, then we have to talk about the way we fight crime, that we have to embrace the kind of strategies that heal community, not the kind of strategies that would result in tearing the fabric of a community through mass incarceration. We talked about training and education for police officers and for community members coming together to get training. And we also talked about officer wellness and safety. And interestingly, when we talked about officer wellness and safety, there was some initial debate about whether or not there should have been a pillar. And the debate was more external than to the task force itself. And I think people came to realize, and I think it's important for everyone here to realize, is if the police are the public and the public are the police, then how we treat the officers is as important as how the officers treat the community. I would even offer to you that how we treat the officers internally is also dictates how they treat the community externally. And so if we want procedural justice, if we understand that people comply with the law, not because they're afraid of the police, but because they believe in the law, they believe it's fair, and more importantly, they believe you're enforcing it equitably, then the same thing applies inside of an agency. The disciplinary process, how they're treated, how people are promoted, how they're hired, all of that links, and we start to realize that we can't have one without the other. We have to make sure we take care of officers, their health, their well-being, the things that we put them into, the chances that they take, the fact that they could be killed in the line of duty or hurt. And some people really don't understand is not only could they be killed in the line of duty, they may be forced to take life in the line of duty. And we focus a lot on use of force, but we also sometimes forget what toll that it has, not just on the person who the force was used on, but the person who used the force. So officer wellness and safety was very important. And we decided by having these pillars that we could then look at take a very comprehensive look at policing and be able to come up with some recommendations. So what we decided to do was build listening sessions, one-day listening sessions on each pillar. And this is the Sheriff Stanek testified on one of the pillars. And by doing that, we ended up listening to over 130 witnesses that testified in front of the task force. Now, this ranged from law enforcement leaders like the sheriff to the law enforcement associations, whether it was major county sheriffs, whether it was the Fraternal Order of Police, so the union was very much involved with it, whether it was the International Association of Chiefs of Police. This included civil rights organizations, the ACLU, the NAACP, the LDF. This included advocacy groups ranging from those that are demonstrating, that those that are fighting for social justice. This included young people to make sure their voice was heard. So we listened to over 130 of them, and we had 6 listening sessions that focused on each pillar, and then we had a 7th listening session that focused on the future of law enforcement. We put that together, and as a result of that, the task force then deliberated and came up with the 60 recommendations for it. Now, if you had a chance to look at the report, the recommendations, the 60-plus recommendations, are then followed by a series of action steps. So let me tell you what we're looking for as we get to this discussion, and we look at what we're expecting and which we would like for our law enforcement partners, both police departments and sheriff's offices, to engage in. The task force, all 11 of the 11 diverse members of the task force, came up with consensus on all the recommendations. Now, that's pretty significant. And first, I think, lesson the task force gave us, quite frankly, before the recommendations was the process itself, that you can bring diverse perspectives to the table, and that people can agree, people can disagree, And more importantly, if I will paraphrase from Dr. King, people can learn to be disagreeable without being violently disagreeable, and it can build consensus around the areas in which they have in common. So you had people that were debating and dialoguing on things that they were very much had diverse positions, came to consensus. So that process is something that can be replicated locally, regionally, where you bring people together, varying people. And come out of the safety zone. Let's don't bring the people that agree with you, bring the people that disagree with you. Bring the people that are going to be your loudest critics, bring them to the table and see if you can build consensus, or at least start to where you do agree. So I thought that was very important. But now that we have these recommendations, I will tell you this. There has not been a meeting that I have had with either the Attorney General or the President in which the first question is not usually, how are the implementation going with the task force? Is the field moving forward with it? Because the key word when the President set it up was, we want concrete recommendations that were tenable. So here's what we're looking for right now. You heard the sheriff say this is exactly what we're looking for, is that one, that we want the 16,000 police departments and sheriff's offices to, one, read it. It's an easy read, 116 pages, I believe, give or take how you count it, in which you can read it to see, one, and then use it to evaluate, are you engaging in these recommendations, right? And a part of that, I would encourage that even community members should look at it and ask the question, is your department or sheriff's office engaging in these practices? Two, if you are, then as you go down the checklist, it should validate a lot of the practices that you're doing. And we're hearing this around the country a lot, especially, and I spent today in the region, I'm hearing from a lot of agencies that they've read it, they've identified a lot of stuff they've been doing, and they've been doing for a long period of time, well before the task force was formed. Which means as a profession, once again, let's acknowledge the great thing that's being done. But they're also acknowledging there's a lot of stuff that we haven't done. So where you haven't implemented, identify if you are going to implement it and how. Now, it's easy to write it in a book. It's hard to implement because there's varying stakeholders. A sheriff or a police chief has to worry about, not worry, but should engage stakeholders, including elected officials, community leaders, union leaders. There's a whole bunch of stakeholders that should come to the table to decide which recommendations you're going to implement and how you're going to actually implement them. So we see that as the process, is to make sure that this report does not sit on the shelf, that it doesn't gather dust, that it is something that will help transform the industry. And I think we can do it. I'm going to end with this because I do want to get to the questions and answers and more about it. But I would say this, as I mentioned earlier, I spent close to 30 years in this field. And I think back to when I got hired in 1985 as a police officer in Oakland. And I think about where we were at the time. We were just starting, if I recall, the crack epidemic. For those who've been around, we can remember those times. And this was in Oakland at the time. I think we ended up in 1992, had something like 170 murders. It was just a violent period in American history. There was a lot of challenges. And I think back, if you would have came up to me in 1985 and asked me things about procedural justice and legitimacy, I would have laughed at you. If you would have said to me, Chief, or at that time would have been officer, do you believe in reentry? And I'd have been, of course I do. My job is to reenter every parolee back into prison because nobody changes. They're all knuckleheads and life will be easier if they're in jail. If I advance now to 2015, we know that's the furthest thing from the truth. That reentry, reducing recidivism rate, reducing the incarceration rate is not only fiscally sound, it's morally correct. It's the right thing to do, and giving people second chances is who we are as a people. So we know that we can grow and that we evolve. If I look at the strategies we used, then I was evaluated in 1985 and 86 on the number of felonies I made. And in fact, the more I made, the more special assignments I achieved, and the more arrests I made. And at that time, my heart and soul was in the right place. I knew that this is what I needed to do. This was my mandate. This was my charge. And so as we start evolving, we realize that some of those strategies have been counterproductive. I don't blame the officers for it, and quite frankly, neither should you. These were the times that this was the policy decisions, they were made, and now as a field, we have to acknowledge that we're advancing. But in that 30 years, I've seen Rodney King incidents occur. I've seen tragedies occur throughout the 30 years. But what I have not seen is for this window of opportunity to exist as it does right now. We've been in crisis before. We've been under the microscope before, and we've had people, we've dealt with generational mistrust for generations, excuse the pun. But right now, if we haven't realized it yet, in my opinion, my humble opinion, we are now amid a new civil rights movement in this country. The question has to be, what role are we going to play in this movement? And it could be a different role than it was in the 50s and 60s and 70s. In the 50s and 60s, we were the tool in many cases of law enforcement to disrupt, to oppress, and to deny. As I look around the country and I look at you, we're the ones that facilitate, support, and encourage. You're the chiefs that are now speaking out against laws that are discriminatory or that you believe are discriminatory. You're the ones that are making it clear that you're going to protect the rights of people to demonstrate, but you're going to protect the people that live in the community against violence and damage and destruction. You're the chiefs now that realize that you have multiple constituencies that you must manage, and simply taking people to jail is not the answer. So at this unique moment, this defining moment in American policing, we have the opportunity to redefine policing in a democratic society. We have the opportunity to reach out to communities that even today feel disenfranchised, disconnected, and have been left behind with regards to advancement, mentoring, opportunities, law enforcement, and equitable distribution of enforcement. We have communities that have been over-enforced. We have communities that have taken the brunt of most of our incarceration policies. We have an opportunity to rectify that. We have the opportunity right now to change how we police and to do so with the support of the public. So this should not be a crisis moment, because in any crisis is an opportunity. As I share with the chiefs, in any crisis there's an opportunity, at least a window of an opportunity that exists. The challenge is, Sheriff, and to everyone here, the window of opportunity is small and it's brief. And if we don't go through that window together now, it will close, and what will open would be the door of past mistakes, which means we'll keep going, repeating the same things over and over again. And I don't have to remind people here that the definition of insanity is do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. So we know where our strengths are at. We know what the successes we've had. We must have the courage that our officers have. The courage to go knock on doors that other people wouldn't knock on. The courage to make contact at 10 o'clock at night or 2 o'clock in the morning. The courage to put on the uniform and to serve. We now must have the courage to have the kind of discussions that this country deserves to have. We have to have the courage to talk about race and policing. We have to have the courage to acknowledge what we've done right, what we have not done right. We have to have the courage to accept the responsibility to move forward so that public safety has a new definition, a new meaning. That no matter where you're from, whether you're a young man in Compton, California, or whether you're from a small town of Minnesota, that your opportunities are the same. And with that, I will end with a program that the president has that makes me think of you in law enforcement. That is My Brother's Keeper. And for those that know the reference, it's a biblical reference, the Cain and Abel, My Brother's Keeper. And it's a program which the president put together that really wants to give young men, particularly young men of color, an opportunity, a fair and equal opportunity to succeed. That's what this country is about. No one is guaranteed success. What should be guaranteed is the opportunity at success. But when I think about My Brother's Keepers, I'm sorry, I think back to my days in policing, and I think about you. Because there is no other group that can say the answer, yes, am I my brother's keeper? You are your brother's keeper, you are your sister's keepers, and quite frankly, you are this nation's keepers. And for those who question you, those who would want to say that you are not doing a great job, I disagree. Know that this administration supports you, this Attorney General respects you, this President respects you. We do have some work to do, we have some changes to make, but we're confident together we'll make it. And with leadership like Sheriff Stanek and the chiefs I had to meet with today, I am just so optimistic that when we look back, we'll just be one of those professions that keeps growing and growing, because we have the courage to acknowledge that which we can do better. And so with that, Sheriff, I will end. I look forward to any discussions, and thank you guys and ladies very much for coming out tonight.